So, hi everyone. Welcome to this week's Inequality and Social Policy Seminar. I'm Maya Sen. I know many of you. I'm the director of the Multidisciplinary Program in Inequality and Social Policy. Just a few opening remarks. This series is made possible by the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Scholars Program in the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy here at HKS. And today we're absolutely delighted to welcome Professor John Donohue of the Stanford Law School. He's going to actually be introduced by one of our program affiliates, Chika Okafor, who's a PhD candidate in economics here at Harvard. Many of you obviously know Chika. Chika?
Hello, everyone. My name is Chika Okafor, and I'm a fourth-year Harvard economics PhD candidate. I am very honored to be introducing Professor John Donohue from Stanford Law School. Early on in my PhD program, one of my closest friends sent me an article from Stanford Magazine written about John. They sent it because they knew the kind of contributions I was hoping to make in the future with my economics and legal training, and they saw very close similarities with the extensive and far-ranging work John has already accomplished. John Donohue has been one of the leading empirical researchers in the legal academy over the past 30 years. He's both an economist and a lawyer, and uses empirical analysis to determine the impact of law and public policy in a wide range of areas, including civil rights and anti-discrimination law, employment discrimination, criminal justice and the death penalty, and factors influencing crime such as guns, incarceration, policing, and legalized abortion. John Donohue is currently the C. Wendell and Edith M. Carl-Smith Professor of Law at Stanford University. Beforehand, he served as a chair professor at Yale Law School and began his academic career as a law professor at Northwestern. John is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a former editor of the American Law and Economics Review, and is a former president of the American Law and Economics Association. John has published in the top journals in both economics and in law, and his work has helped shape policy conversations around the country for decades. He is the scholar who I most wanted to invite for this program. And so, without further ado, I'm truly honored to introduce Professor John Donohue to our Harvard Inequality and Social Policy Seminar. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. I'm going to take a second to share screen, but I just want to thank Chika for that very generous introduction. I wish my mom had been around to hear that. She always wanted a doctor and didn't quite feel that I made it. So it's sort of a fun thing for me to talk about this topic after years of being away from it. So it's sort of a walk down memory lane. So the crime drop in the 1990s was really a stunning socioeconomic event, and you know, when we think of stunning socioeconomic events, we assume they're going to be horrible. But this was actually a benign event to get a crime drop of the magnitude that we had. And at the time when this was happening, the typical factors that were offered to explain a drop of this magnitude fell far short of establishing a drop in crime of this dimension. So this was the email that sort of signaled where we were in December of 1998. So Steve wrote to me and he goes, on the abortion and crime thing, do you have any real evidence to support your conjecture that abortion lowers crime? And so that was sort of the start of the whole enterprise. And so our thesis was that unwanted children are at risk for higher rates of crime, and that abortion legalization dramatically reduced the unwanted births. And with a delay of 18 to 20 years, one starts seeing a drop in crime because of that. So that was the thesis. And interestingly, my two friends, Phil Cook and Jens Ludwig, recently wrote, Donohue and Levitt's study of the effects of legalized abortion on crime has been the subject of intensive public scrutiny, almost unheard of in the academic research. And Steve and I were just yesterday, or actually Friday, a podcast where Steve interviewed me came out, and we were reminiscing about how insane the reaction was when this study first hit the street. So interestingly, at the time that we did this study, we pointed out that the impact of legalized abortion, if the thesis were correct, would be felt over many, many more years, because as we indicated, the effect of legalized abortion does not emerge for about 18 to 20 years, and you were still seeing a very substantial increase in the rate of abortion, and therefore, again, assuming that the thesis is correct, it takes a while for those cohorts born after legalization to move through their high crime years. So we concluded our paper with the following claim. When a steady state is reached roughly 20 years from now, so this is writing in 2001, the impact of abortion will be roughly twice as great as the impact felt so far. Our results suggest that all else equal, legalized abortion will account for persistent declines of 1% a year in crime over the next 2 decades. So essentially what we did in the latest paper was just say, let's use the exact same models that we had. We're not going to tinker with any of the specification or anything, and just see, does the prediction that we made in the 2001 paper hold out when we have 17 more years of additional data beyond what we had at the time of that paper. So that's what is the genesis of this paper. And amazingly to us, we had 17 more years of data, and the same crime specification that we had used 20 years ago predicted that crime fell by 17.5% over those 17 years. So the 1% prediction was spot on in a sense that was almost eerie to us. And the estimated coefficient on legalized abortion for the period since our paper was actually larger. And part of the reason for that, I'll talk about later, is that we do seem to be getting more precise measures of both abortion and population over time. And whenever you have measurement error, it tends to sort of bias your estimates downward. And so a lot of this paper and the work we've been doing over the last 20 years, whenever we looked at this, has been trying to be attentive to measurement error issues. So the cumulative impact of legalized abortion on crime over 35 years is substantial. And over this period, there was a roughly 50% decline in crime from the peak in the early 1990s, and a very substantial portion of that could be explained by the legalization of abortion. Now, I should say, let's say, just to pick a round number, that we predict over this period there was a 40% decline in crime because of the legalization of abortion. That means other things equal. And there were other factors that were either suppressing crime or increasing crime. And so it's not as though the 40% is the only thing that's going on, but we do think there's at least a strong body of evidence that suggests that legalized abortion played a role, and that's what I'll try to go through today. I should say that I'm happy to take questions of any kind at any time. Maybe at the end, if I haven't gotten at all my points, I'll hold off on the questions just to get out everything, but feel free to jump in at any time. So I should note that when we were thinking about this, or I guess I started first thinking about this, many people were coming out with the exact opposite conclusion. They were predicting that crime was going to be rising. And now part of this was political. So in November 1995, essentially, Republican strategy was, how can we undermine Bill Clinton's election prospects, where crime has always been a big benefit for Republican candidates, but crime was dropping very sharply during the first 4 years of the Clinton administration, and that was thought to be something that they had to undermine. And so this thing called the Council on Crime in America, they brought in Carter's Attorney General Griffin Bell to be one of the co-chairs, but this really was a shill organization, sort of in the Fox News way, to try to undermine Clinton's re-election prospects. And this was the headline that many papers emphasized. America is a ticking violent crime bomb, and there's little time remaining to prepare for the blast. And that was the imagery that John DiIulio, then a Princeton professor, who had independently written, he was a member of that Council on Crime in America. And he said, over the last 15 years, I spent a good deal of time doing in-depth interviews with all of these criminal justice people. And most of the hundreds with whom I have spoken over the last few years are convinced that America is a ticking crime bomb. And that's literally all he had for making that prediction. It was just almost complete nonsense, but it worked out well for him in the sense that he became, he got a position in the White House when George W. Bush was elected president. And so he was going on, and he was the one who coined the phrase about the super predators, the ever-growing number of hardened, remorseless juveniles who were showing up in the system. You know, they kill or maim on impulse without any intelligible motive. We are most definitely in the early stages of a youth crime wave, a new, more violent breed of predatory street offender than any we have ever seen before. So this was all DiIulio's imagination wedded to Republican attacks that were essentially aimed at Bill Clinton. And James Allen Fox, the Dean of Criminal Justice, chimed in. We are facing a bloodbath of teen violence in the years ahead that will make 1995 look like the good old days. While they were predicting a bloodbath, I heard Rebecca Blank at the ABF, American Bar Foundation, discuss state abortion rates. And it was clear that the women who were relying on abortion very heavily were young, unwed, inner city, low education, poor women, and their children were very much at risk. And so when the major criminologists were predicting a crime explosion, I was predicting that crime drop based on the massive increase in abortion in the 70s. And we, of course, did get a very big crime drop. After 1992, there was a 50% drop in violent crime. And most legal changes have small impacts, but the change in abortion was really quite profound. In the peak year, almost 1 of every 3 conceptions ended in abortion. And even now, when abortion is dramatically lower than it was at the peak, 18% of pregnancies end in abortion today in the US, which is down quite a bit, but still very large. So one of the things we learned about was the literature on the adverse impact of unwantedness on life outcomes. There were a number of interesting studies in Europe at a very micro level of detail, because during the post-war years, many countries required mothers to get approval to have an abortion. And some of the researchers followed children of mothers who were denied approval, and they found that the mothers who were denied approval then went ahead and had their child, and that those children were at substantially higher risk of poorer life outcomes, including higher crime rates. And that was controlling for lots and lots of features about the mothers. Here was one particular study where the authors followed 220 children born in the early 60s to women twice denied abortion. So they applied for the right to have an abortion. They were denied, they appealed it, they were denied again, and they then went ahead and had their children. And the researchers matched controls and even controlled for other children in the family. So it was not simply a selection effect that these are bad mothers or something like that. There was really something going on that if you were trying to have an abortion, there was a reason that that child was going to be at higher risk, which was actually exactly what the Supreme Court had said in Roe versus Wade. So even when siblings were used as controls, the children who were the product of the failure of the mother to get an abortion were at much higher risk. So they had twice as high rates of criminal activity. When they were sentenced to prison, the sentences were more than twice as long, and they were in foster care 5 to 6 times as often and far more likely to suffer from alcoholism or drug addiction. And this point about alcoholism is an interesting one because a recent paper uh, talking about the drop in crime mimics something that we also have found, that rates of alcohol consumption are correlated with crime. And for youth, there has been a benign decline in the rate of alcoholism, which is good. But part of that could be engineered through the process of legalized abortion. So it's an unambiguously good thing, and whether abortion played a role or not, we will look at. But here we have evidence from Europe that it does have that impact. And so this is the quote from Roe versus Wade that I alluded to, where the court said the detriment that the state would impose upon the pregnant woman by denying this choice is apparent. Specific and direct harm, medically diagnosable, even in early pregnancy, may be involved. Maternity or additional offspring may force upon the woman a distressful life and future. Psychological harm may be imminent. Mental and physical health may be taxed. There is also the distress for all concerned associated with the unwanted child, and there is the problem of bringing a child into a family already unable psychologically and otherwise to care for it. So we had mentioned in some earlier work that I did with my co-author Peter Siegelman and Nobel Prize winner in 2000 Jim Heckman, also our co-author, has really emphasized that programs like the Perry Preschool have quite an impact in reducing negative life outcomes. So this is part of an overall literature that things that correlate with your early life environment can have a very substantial effect on adult performance and even economic outcomes. So unwanted children are at greater risk for many negative outcomes. And I'll just give a couple of, obviously highly unusual anecdotes, but I think that at least gives you a sense of the impact of this particular legal change. So one was a mother who was very troubled in Norway with her own mental illness. She had fled an abusive household at age 17, and when she became pregnant, she sought an abortion, but in Norway at the time, there was a very strict cutoff at 3 months, and it was a little bit after that. And she tried to say that the unborn baby was a nasty child that was wreaking havoc and tormenting her, but she was not allowed to have the abortion. And so the child was born. The mother stopped breastfeeding, saying that the child was sucking the life out of her. And in 1983 and 84, some child psychologists wanted to remove the child from the mother because of the misconduct that she was engaging in, but the state did not allow that. So the child remained with the mother. And she openly stated that she wished her son was dead. And that was Anders Breivik, who at age 32 killed, it said 7, but it was 67 people in the mass shooting in Norway that is to this day the single most deadly mass shooting in the world. Another example was from Texas in the early 60s, before Roe versus Wade. Another mother with very significant mental illness and alcoholism, who was married but had repeated multiple pregnancies in a relationship with her employer. And finally, she became pregnant with twins, and she realized that she could not care for more children. So she tried to self-abort. One fetus died and the other was born with brain damage. So then she became pregnant yet again with the same employer. And she reluctantly gave birth to Clifford Bogus in 1965, who she badly beat and neglected. And when he was 11 months old, the state removed all 8 of her children because of the neglect. And they were later returned to her, but she said, I don't want Clifford back because I can't deal with an infant. And he was bounced around from, you know, various foster homes and rejected, and ended up, killing 2 elderly men when he was, in his early 20s, I believe, finally executed by the state. So it gives you a sense that one aspect of abortion is it does prevent uh, pregnancies when the mother is really in some dire conditions. Um, so going back to our initial paper, we showed that there were 5 states that legalized earlier than the rest of the country, and they got a bigger drop in crime than other states, and also an earlier drop in crime, again, consistent with the theory. Um, and, as the paper shows, if you compare the early legalizers with the rest of the country, they had substantially bigger drops in crime over the entire period from 1982 through 2014. And that's true whether you look at violent crime, property crime, or murder. And we actually give 2 different metrics for murder. One is the UCR metric, and one is the vital statistics metric. Phil Cook at Duke had strongly encouraged us to use the vital statistics metric because sadly, the criminal justice statistics are getting weaker over time rather than better over time, as a number of states are not fully complying with what I think should be an obligation on their part to give the FBI good crime data. So you can see some rather large discrepancies between the vital statistics numbers and the Uniform Crime Reports numbers, which are a little troubling. We present them both because we did use UCR in our initial paper, but we now append the vital statistics numbers. So we also divided the country into the 17 jurisdictions with the lowest rates of abortion, medium, the middle 17, and then the highest rates of abortion. And again, vastly greater crime drops in the high abortion states, with the medium abortion states being next, and low abortion states having the smallest drops or even increases. So the paper shows the summary statistics and gives you a sense of the explanatory variables that we had available to us. And it's a fairly straightforward panel data analysis where we're looking at 51 jurisdictions, the 50 states and the District of Columbia over time, and trying to see what is the relationship between the extent of abortion. Sorry, my lights just went out. The extent of abortion in a state many years before, and the crime rate, when those cohorts finally get into their high crime areas. And we control for state and year fixed effects. Here are the explanatory variables that we use in addition to state and year fixed effects. And this just gives you a sense of the item which we call the effective abortion rate, which is trying to link up what is the abortion rate that would be influencing crime, 18 to 20 years later. And you can see that since property crime is typically conducted by younger criminals, the effective abortion rate, in other words, the abortion rate that we expect would affect property crime, emerges more rapidly than it does for murder, which tends to be committed by somewhat older individuals. And so this is the basic panel data result. And what you see is that we have a new line for the impact of abortion over the period 1998 to 2014. So these are the new results the top line is essentially what we were showing 20 years ago. And you can see that every 100 per 1,000 abortions per live births is essentially diminishing crime by 15 to 20% roughly. And 100 is a little bit less than a standard deviation of the abortion rate. So a very substantial impact. Notice that the T statistics here are enormous. So just looking at violent crime, it's a T statistic of basically 10, which at least in my work is almost unknown that I would get T statistics of this magnitude, and no other explanatory variable that I've ever seen introduced into a panel data model of crime, and I look at these papers all the time myself, ever comes close to having a T statistic of that magnitude. So there really is something there. We'll discuss whether this is a causal impact or picking up some correlation, but I find it intensely interesting whether it's causal or correlational. Causal, if it is, ends the story. If it's correlational, then more work needs to be done. But I think it's an important enough finding in either event to merit further inquiry and scrutiny. So another analysis that we did was we just split the country into equal population sizes based on the 1985 population and said what happened with abortion in those higher abortion states versus the low abortion states. And you can see a very substantial difference in the rate of abortion in these two elements of the two halves of the country. And what you see is that violent crime had moved in almost perfectly parallel trends for the high abortion and the low abortion halves of the country. But that all changed after about 1991, which is essentially when you start expecting to see an impact on violent crime. And you can see this enormous drop in violent crime in the high abortion states relative to the low abortion states. So the very vast divergence and higher crime rates that the high abortion states had traditionally had has now virtually been eliminated. And so in 1991, that difference was about 275 violent crimes per 100,000 more in the high abortion states. And now you can see it's gone down to almost zero. And so this is just giving you that same information in a slightly different format where you can see what we're doing over time is showing the difference in violent crime rates between the high and the low abortion rate states. And as I mentioned, it was just a little under 300 in 1991. And then it fell very sharply as the higher rates of abortion were emerging in the high abortion states. So that's the violent crime story, and you can do the same thing for murder. And again, as the effective abortion rate differential grows in the post-1990 period, you see these large drops in murder, and the same thing corresponds to property crime. So you're seeing very similar patterns. Now, people said, well, maybe you just got higher rates of incarceration in the high abortion states, and that's what explained their greater drop in crime. But actually, it was the low abortion states that had the higher increases in the rate of incarceration, and also no difference in the increases in police staffing in the two areas. So the two major criminal justice elements that you might think of are playing a role were not leading to bigger drops in crimes in the high abortion states. So it has to be something other than police or incarceration that explains why high abortion states did so much better. So everything that we've looked at so far was looking at crime, and that's the area where we expect to see the impact. But the problem with looking at crime data is you don't have specific age information about who is committing the crime. So to get that, we turned our attention to arrest rates, where you can get information on the age of the arrested individual. So when we look at that, our panel data model looks at the arrest rate for each age in each state, and then links back to the drop in arrests to the abortion rate at the time that the cohort in question was in utero. So in other words, if I'm looking at the arrest rates for 15-year-olds in New York, let's say, I will look back and link to that cohort. What was the abortion rate, essentially 16 years earlier? That would be the one relevant to a cohort of 15-year-olds 15 years later, or 16 years later. And so it's a very tight link between what we think is the relevant abortion rate in a state and the crime for that cohort X years later. So this links, let's say, the abortion rate in 1974 to the crime rate for 20-year-olds in 1995, supporting the theory that higher abortion rates in a state in 74 would screen out more unwanted births, leaving a less crime-prone 20-year-old population in 1995. And so the arrest rate analysis deals with any statewide omitted effect because it identifies our effect by holding constant whatever the overall crime pattern is in a given state in a given year. So by that, I mean, we control for the state year level of crime for any state. Let's say it fell by 3%, and controlling for that change in that state in that year, we then look to see, can we say something about whether the cohorts that were born with higher rates of abortion had a bigger drop in crime? And that's what the arrest rate analysis shows very clearly for violent crime. So again, this probes whether crime fell more for, say, 19-year-olds than for 20-year-olds in a state if the abortion rate relevant to 19-year-olds was higher than it was for 20-year-olds. And you can see how that happens, of course, because if we're looking at the cutoff between, Roe versus Wade has been adopted in 1973, that means that someone who was born in 1972, 20 years later, was not born after legalization, but someone who was 19-year-olds would have been, and this is what the statistical analysis is trying to tell us. So here is the pattern of abortion, and you can see that abortions rose very sharply and then have been trending down over this period. Okay, so let me just jump ahead. And so this is the actual equation that we use in our arrest rate analysis. And here are the basic findings. So again, our initial paper was looking at this earlier period. The subsequent paper brings in the 1998 through 2014 data. And so this is just looking at arrest rates and arrests by single year of age. And you see a pretty statistically significant effect on both the level of violent arrests and the level of property arrests. And you can look at the two individual time periods, and you can see that the effect is greater in the second time period than it is in the first time period. Or you can look at the overall period, 1985 to 2014, in a separate regression. And again, you see very strong statistically significant effects. One of the interesting points that was made in criticism of our initial paper was a nice paper by Foote and Getz, which said Well, you have been using a clustering by state year. We think you should cluster by state, which is a more rigorous uh, clustering that will sort of expand your standard errors and of course, therefore make it harder to establish statistical significance. And you can see that doing that, which is the second line, does not change the level of statistical significance is still in excess of 5% in all of these cases, and in most of them is greater than the 0.01 level. So the results are pretty impressive statistically. And we then tried to make some adjustments to deal with what I have been already referencing is the issue of measurement error. So first of all, there's some imprecision whenever you're trying to correlate a level of abortion with arrest rates because you could be born early in the year or have your abortion later in the year. And so we tried to tighten up those by looking at the actual month and year of birth of the individual. We then tried to adjust the abortion measure to reflect the fact that some women are living in, let's say, New York at the time that they have an abortion, but then they move to some other area with their child if they have the child. And we wanted to see what happens to the cohorts that were born post legalization, wherever they were, because of course, that's where they're going to be committing any crime. So we followed the mobility patterns. And then we also tried to use an instrumental variable approach to address the issue of measurement error in the abortion variable. So essentially, if you have two independent measures, both imprecisely measured, if you instrument one for the other, you can weed out some of the noise. And we did find this to be the case. So our estimates rose very sharply in value. So just compare back to where we were here. So if you look at the abortion rate effect for violent crime, let's say it's 3% or 6% in the two time periods in our first uncontrolled for regression. Now, when we jump ahead and make these controls for measurement error, you can see the magnitudes have risen quite substantially, particularly in the first period where the measurement error was greater. So measurement error played a big role. So essentially, if you look over the entire period, the results are very strong. The one area that we don't see the abortion effect playing a role is for property crime in the second period. And I'll have more to say about that in a second. So the Foote and Goetz critique was that they said that the crucial test needed to eliminate potential omitted variable bias on the state year level would focus on a per capita arrest rate regression that included state year fixed effects. So let's look at that. They said this would control for factors influencing crime in a given state year and determine whether the abortion rate at the time of any birth cohort would affect the arrest rate for that cohort 15 to 24 years later. Okay, so so then the question is, what is the correct specification? Should we use a per capita regression or some other metric? And the problem with the per capita regression is that the denominator of the dependent variable, remember the dependent variable is the measure of arrests per population, is the identical denominator of the key abortion rate variable. And so that gives you an econometric problem. You're going to sort of bias your estimate against a finding of a relationship here. So Foote and Goetz acknowledged that the population variable is measured with error so that the estimated effect will be upward biased, therefore understating the dampening effect that abortion had on the per capita arrest rate. And so here is the violent arrests per capita And you can see what the estimated effects are here. And here is our alternative specification where we try to address uh, the problem of ratio bias that occurs from having this population measure both on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of your key variables, the dependent variable and the abortion rate variable. And you can see that when we do this, the estimated impact of population on arrests is far below 1, which is again signaling that you've got a problem of your population measure being measured with some level of error. But the impact on the abortion measure is quite strong. So you can see that these numbers again are indicating a very substantial dampening effect of abortion on violent arrests when we have linked the actual abortion rate for that cohort in that state with the violent arrests for that cohort in that state. Okay. And so we did it in 2 ways. Some people suggested maybe your results are being driven by, high abortion jurisdictions like New York or DC. And one thing that we noticed was that we only had complete arrest data for 26 states. So we ran our same regression just on the 26 states that we had complete data for. So that's dropping New York, Florida, DC, Pennsylvania. So these are not states that we chose, but just by virtue of the fact that they did not have complete arrest data over our entire period. And you can see, if anything, the results got stronger, even though we were using a much smaller sample, because we had eliminated roughly half the number of states from the analysis. So
John,
again,
I'm actually going to interrupt you for one moment. We're running short on the presentation time. I want to make sure to leave enough minutes for the Q&A. So
Yep.
I invite you to just take a couple of moments to kind of wrap up so we have time for the Q&A. I hate to interrupt you, but.
No, perfect. And I'm just about where I wanted to end with these basic results. But let me just say one thing about what happened with property in the second period, where the effect looks small, even though it's very large for property in the first period and for violent crime always. And that was one of the interesting things that we learned in the course of doing this paper. Look at what happened for property crime arrests over this period. They stayed very high, even though property crime itself was dropping very substantially. And so essentially what I think was happening was that as crime fell very dramatically, the police had less to do. So they started arresting more people for property crimes. And of course, property crimes are much more abundant than any other type of crime. So when we did our arrest rate analysis, we weren't seeing the drop in arrests that we had expected to see. But part of that was because there was no drop in arrests, even though there was an enormous drop in crime. And our paper predicted a drop in crime. And what offset that drop in crime was the increase in the number of arrests per crime. So let me end there. That's the basic story, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we have a number of questions already in the chat, and I invite people to use the raise hand feature. And John, I can call on them or you can call on them, but let me kick this off by pointing everyone to a question that was in the chat from Evan McKay. So Evan wanted to know, similar to a question that was asked earlier, how long-acting reversible contraception such as IUDs or implants impact the measure of abortion rates and the confidence in the measure, and if you discuss influence of contraception at all on crime by people using or not using contraception and by their children. And then we'll go through the people who've raised their hands and other questions in the chat. So we'll start with that one, and then people will have time to raise more questions.
Yeah, great question. And of course, nothing that we say here is like an endorsement of abortion as a way to reduce the number of unwanted children. Of course, what you would like to see is eliminating unwanted pregnancies. And to the extent that people use contraception, that's a terrific advance over, relying on abortion, which is, of course, a much more draconian impact on the body than contraception would be. But a couple of points need to be made. If you look at the last 30, 40 years in this country compared to all of the other high-income countries, we by far are the country that has the lowest rate of contraception use, even though, of course, it has risen, and have had the highest rates of teen pregnancy, teen abortion, and teen births, in part because our contraception rates are so much lower than the other affluent countries. And there is also a sort of selection effect going on, that mothers who are higher income and also higher education tend to use contraception much more frequently, and their kids are protected from some of these adverse outcomes in the way that wealth and socioeconomic status reduce problems for families and allow them to avoid the criminal justice snare in a way. So clearly, contraception can play an important role, but it seems not to overcome the impact of legalized abortion.
I know there are a couple hands up, but I wanted to direct everyone to Jenny Mansbridge, who has a couple of questions in the chat, but I just told her I would just call on her. Jenny, are you there?
I'm not sure my question was important as others. Way back, you had a rather dramatic graph showing, maybe you could find it again, showing high parts of the country that were were much more legal to abortion, and then parts of the country that had low abortion rates. This is the graph I'm at. And maybe I'm misreading this. Did this mean that the high abortion states had also higher crime rates in 1990?
Yeah. So tradition.
And why was I thought maybe that was what I was reading. Why is that? In other words, what abortion does is it brings it down to the low. Why did the low abortion states have such low crime rates?
Yeah, so essentially this is largely an urbanization phenomenon, that urban crime is always higher than rural crime. And so for, decades before Roe versus Wade, this pattern existed with much higher crime rate in the more urbanized jurisdictions. And now we see for violent crime, it came down to the same level as the more rural states. And for property crime, it's now gone below the rural level. And you can see the same thing for murder. The murder rates have now gone below in the high abortion states compared to the low abortion states. So
it's a kind of interaction effect. In other words, if you were a low abortion state, you could afford to be a low abortion state because you didn't have very much crime anyway, so to speak. Right? In other words, it's an interaction between urban and this abortion rate.
Yeah. Well, we think that the low abortion states did still get some benefit from the level of abortion that they had, but it just wasn't anywhere near as profound because they restricted abortion to a much greater degree.
Thank you.
Sasha, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously the causal identification challenges here are intense, but those have been discussed elsewhere. And I want to focus instead on really the interpretation. So even if we believe these total effects of abortion, my understanding is that your proposed causal theory, the mechanism here is about unwanted births as this unmeasured mechanism linking abortion to crime. And in the 2001 paper, you also did a back of the envelope calculation suggesting that above and beyond unwantedness, declines in fertility rates were more pronounced for Black women, for teenagers, and for unmarried women. And that all contributed also potentially to the decline in crime rates. And obviously with the total effects, we can't partial any of this out. So my question is just, given long-standing efforts to control the fertility of poor women and women of color because of panic about what kind of children they might have, and very much connected to the racialized rhetoric of fear of crime that you cited earlier in the presentation, I guess I'm surprised your paper then and now didn't explicitly push back on a more pernicious interpretation that crime rates would go down if only certain kinds of women wouldn't have children. And here, by focusing on unwantedness, I think you don't directly connect it to race and class, but it still seems like there's an opportunity here to make a more social and structural interpretation of how our society criminalizes certain folks, how we construct connections between race, poverty, unintended pregnancy, crime, criminalization. And I just wondered why you didn't choose to engage that and how you would interpret the results.
Yeah, and Steve and I have had a lot of discussions about this, and Steve sort of wanted to sort of back away from some of the more contentious issues, because he just felt, look, this is such an important element to say, can we explain this incredible drop in crime? And so our focus should be on that rather than some of these broader social questions. But I think they're certainly teed up. A couple of points that I would make is that it's so interesting to look at the studies that were done in Europe, in Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, where, of course, this was purely a phenomenon in the white community of those jurisdictions at that time. So none of this, implicates race in the broadest sense. It does seem to be the case, as the European studies show, that if the child was unwanted and the mother wanted to have an abortion but was forced to bring that child to term, the child was going to be at higher risk. But of course, anytime you're talking about crime and criminal justice, there are going to be all of these racial and socioeconomic dimensions that are implicated by that. And I think, one thing that we, do want to be cautious about is just the sort of moral panic that you allude to. And it's actually part of a broader problem in American society right now, that certain political interests realize that fear mongering, whether it's about immigration or about crime, can have very powerful effects. And I was going to mention this in my subsequent discussion of Chika's paper, that politically, you can see how certain groups have tried to raise enormous fears about crime and race and immigration. And even just this week, Paul Krugman sort of impishly tweeted out a study from, or an article from the Wall Street Journal that said, get ready for out of control inflation and, skyrocketing debt. And so I started reading the paper, and it was saying, all hell is going to happen, and interest rates and inflation are going to skyrocket. And then I noticed that the article was written in 2009, and of course none of those predictions came through. And so I do think that the sort of role of the academic is perhaps to push back against the overheated rhetoric with a more sober and scientific evaluation. And that's what we've tried to do, and whether we're successful or not, we hope we're at least raising interesting questions for the broader academic community to answer.
I'll go to a question from the chat. We do have time for a couple more questions. Chris Winship had a question about lead. So he writes, much research has suggested that drops in exposure to lead has been a major contributor to the drop in crime. Is this a complementary or competing explanation for the crime drop?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just pull up a slide here if I can find it quickly. So this is from Jessica Ree's paper. It's one of the major papers that advances the claim that lead exposure was a powerful impact. And this is from her paper where she actually uses our data on abortion and adds it into her panel data. And you can see that the impact of abortion is still very, very substantial, and that it reduces the impact of her lead variables, at least in terms of statistical significance. So I do think that the lead story is a real one and an important concern, but I don't think it undermines the abortion effect. And I was actually very intrigued by this graph because I thought, if it really is this story of just low socioeconomic people being the ones that are aborted, and that's what's driving the results, maybe you would see so much correlation between the lead effect and the abortion effect. And when we don't see it here, I think it emphasizes the point that something important is being told by the abortion story that is different from the lead story.
John, that's actually a perfect segue to the last question we just got. Lisa wanted to know what motivated this research and how did this research question occur to you when there's so many other variables and considerations? And we'll make that the last question because I know people have to go at 1:15. So if you have to go, feel free to go. But go ahead, John.
Yeah, great. It was purely motivated by the fact that I saw Rebecca Blank talking about abortion at a seminar at the American Bar Foundation, which is a place where I was then working, and Steve later came to work. And so I started thinking about what the impacts of that would be. And crime was falling in those days, and yet at the same time, you were getting these enormous predictions of a crime rise. And so that's what really motivated me to put these things together and then try to figure out if we could establish a link between abortion and crime, which is what we ended up doing. And of course, the early paper had a relatively limited amount of data to make the argument. Our arrest data ended in 1996, and we basically said you wouldn't expect to see this effect emerging until 1991. So we really only had a limited number of years to make it. I think now that we have 17 years of additional data, the evidence in support of this link is vastly stronger than it was when the initial paper came out.
All right, so with that, we are actually out of time. I want to thank John Donahue again for being here and for such interesting work.